There was some confusion, particularly a couple of teams didn't really understand what I was asking for, and I must share some of the blame for that. But I did say several times that I want to answer any questions you might have and be available to clarify. The basic ground rules were, by the end of this semester, you would have had put together something, I hesitate to call it a document, something that represents a simulation of what pre-design programming activity, a record of programming pre-design activity required to initiate the design of this, redesign of this building, school architecture building. And in doing that, you were going to be doing some role playing. And at the end of the semester, there would be something that you could demonstrate that reflects your particular team's approach to how that pre-design and programming activity should occur, with illustrative examples of different parts of it. So I'm not even saying it's a document with chapters. It might be a tool. It might be an app. It might be a model. It might be, what we're really trying to do is, in a sense, kind of reinvent what programming is. Or, if your team feels strongly that conventional, traditional programming is the way to go, that's okay too. But I'm encouraging people to think creatively, think more beyond the surface of what you might see in any textbook or anything that exists right now about programming. That you do this, then you do that, then you do this, then you do that, and there you are. You have a document, you give it to the architect, he designs. That's sort of the model of the 20th century. That's the model before the technology we have now, the way we think about designing and so on. Now, I did not ask you, and I did not expect you to do a work plan all the way through construction and occupancy. I really just wanted to see the work plan up to the point at which what we might call programming pre-design has completed. Now, if your team feels that programming and design are kind of intertwined, they're really just one sort of circling, intertwining activity, then your description of how this would be handled would include that design programming activity. If you, on the other hand, feel that there's a real separation between program and pre-design and design, your activity would all be all about that pre-design and programming and not the design part. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't have a designer on the programming team as part of the team, but there wouldn't really be any designing as such going on. It's mostly about coming up with a description of what has to be designed and how it should be designed. Now, some teams gave me a schedule that took it all the way through construction during this semester. And now I know that was a simulation and it was kind of a pretend thing, but no, I wanted you to have a work plan for your team, for how your team is going to go through in the time we have left, which is only 8.5 weeks. There's not much time left. We've already chewed up like a good third of the semester. So there's like 8.5, 9 weeks, and we want to leave a couple of days at the end before jury week, because jury week, we're not supposed to have assignments due during jury week. In fact, it's kind of bad to have assignments due the week before jury week, because that's when you're really crunching to get your studio work done. But anyhow, we really don't have much choice. So that comes down to 8.5 weeks. So in the 8.5 weeks, the challenge is, how can your team figure out what you need to do between now and the end of that period to demonstrate that programming and pre-design philosophy and approach that your team feels is the right way to go to do the pre-design activity for this building, the birth of the School of Architecture building in the 21st century, according to what is happening today and in the future. Now, some of you suggested that there should be a design competition. If you're going to do that, there needs to be some reasoning for that, because design competitions work well as ideas competitions and conceptual ideas, but as a design, usually they're pretty disastrous. You get creative ideas come out, but if you then go ahead and try and build whatever the competition entry is, it's usually not a good idea. And we tried to pick an architect through competition and not pick the design, but that failed. We ended up having to build the competition entry, which turned out to be kind of a mistake. And I have to take some blame for that, because I was, the dean at the time and I came up with this idea of just picking an architect through a competition. The other thing I noticed is that virtually everyone gave me diagrams that some of which I kind of had seen before, some of which I knew were previously published in various websites and places, books, things that have been scanned. But it was hard for me to tell what was an original diagram that you had constructed from scratch, and what was something that you had borrowed and maybe modified slightly or added something to it. So what you need to do is, I want virtually everyone who didn't do this to resubmit with sources, citations, indicate whether it's your diagram, or if it's a diagram. It's okay to have diagrams from other sources, as long as you identify that that's what it is. I don't want to, give you credit for something you didn't actually. I don't want to give you the kind of credit that you would get if you built the diagram, very nice, beautiful diagram from scratch, and then I think, wow, that's really amazing, you did a great job, but in fact, you didn't really build the diagram. You're using it, maybe you're doing something with it, and it's probably a very good diagram.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
That came up in ours. One of ours, we grabbed an image, and it said in the caption of it, it says image courtesy of HOK.
I saw that. Yeah.
But would you also like us to put in like the web link source where we pulled it from, or is that enough of a citation that came from?
That one's okay. I
Okay.
noticed that. That was the only case I saw where somebody said that diagram
Yeah, that
was
was where we
courtesy
knew
of.
we pulled it. It was okay.
You could either put a little text box underneath that says source,
Like the source
and put the name.
Website there or whatever.
Maybe it's a website, maybe it's an architectural firm, maybe it's a book, whatever, magazine. And if it's something that you reworked, seriously, you could put a adapted from and put the source. That really helps me to understand what you've done and what you haven't done. So let's get into this. I don't know, in this team, where's the names of the team members? Oh, down here. Okay, who wants to come up? Maybe the whole team should come up and kind of give us a rundown of what your team, first of all, what your philosophy is about programming, and then take us through your presentation. And somebody could operate it's on the laptop.
Well, I guess pretty much our philosophy toward the pre-design and programming process would be that it's a lot more integrated and that everyone has a hand, but they come to the table with the specific things that they would be best at gathering information for the actual pre-design process. Technology really has a hand in this as far as expediting this process, and that's primarily what's displayed in this diagram here, is just the idea of communication and the garnering of information, the way that information is digested from one individual to the next, and then delivered to the next individual to not only help the information and the deliverable that the next individual is working on, but also to be incorporated into it. So our idea display this overall was to come up with a chart that down the far left-hand column is the very generic, very general idea of what roles are going to be played and sort of the time frames. Very, very general as far as the workflow that way, but really establishing first and foremost where the information is going to be coming from and who's going to be involved in that, to then further take this chart and develop a more logistical schedule.
I haven't seen this before, so it's those two. You don't have another sheet to it or anything? Is there more?
There's more.
There's more sheets, but there are more.
As far as our,
It's still not present.
as far as our plan for the implementation of the program, this is a chart.
Okay.
That outlines all of it. So we go into the feasibility study where we look at the desires and controls. And
That would basically be the client and the programmer
Okay.
really interacting.
So, with the client, we kind of divided it up, where it's like what the state of Florida wants, then what FAMU wants, and then what the actual client wants. And usually, it's just like a comparison, like, the client's desire is gonna be way more than what the state probably requires, or what, FAMU
Client being
requires.
the school.
Yeah, the school, the people, the users of the building.
Because it's sort of a learn as you go and experiment as you go, the very first implementation plan was just to get an idea as far as what's going to be needed to put forward into the pre-design, but also the program itself. And with that in mind, we are making it as we go. So therefore, with these next few pieces, it was an idea of establishing the underlying guidelines and rules that we're all going to work by, and then taking that information and perhaps now making another graphic that will establish how those things are going to interrelate and how those things will complement each other.
You know, just as a technical matter, the client is really the state of Florida, and we are the users. The terminology.
Okay.
So you're saying it's kind of a heuristic process in that you're learning as you're going and then revising and adjusting from that learning process?
So it's kind of difficult to come up with an overall, this is the definitive work plan, because
Right.
experimentation, you kind of have to give yourself.
But even saying that is a work plan.
Right.
That is a type of work plan.
Right.
It's kind of like how we were working in a group, just trying to get the PowerPoint done and thinking of what she's writing the list of what our desires are, and I'm asking her what she means by this, and
Yeah.
he's,
We're,
you know.
That's a good point, because you're kind of doing a simulation of the design, programming and pre-design, and even the early design process, in the process of designing this presentation and putting it together.
and I, serving as the engineers and contractors, kind of lay out some of the controls just based on codes and regulations that are already in place, and
Yeah.
and then we also have just resource availability, which is based on perhaps a budget that is not yet approved, or that we don't yet have.
You know,
defined
just
enough.
as for everyone's benefit, the way this always works is that the budget has already been allocated by the, some authority, either it's the state of Florida, it's a special, the legislature has made a special allocation for this purpose, or the university has set aside in its budgeting and budget request a certain amount of money for this project, so that's kind of a given, the budget. But I don't want you guys to get hung up on that part of it, because that's so much out of your control. It's not something where you do this great analysis and then you say, okay, based on all this analysis, we need this much money. I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. It really, it's all much less logical. Yeah.
I noticed that when you're talking about your roles, that you have an architect. Is that an architect that's an outside architect that's been hired in at this programming phase, or are you like the owner architect, like a facilities architect, and you have hired someone else
yet? Which role are you playing?
For the purposes of this, what's difficult, of course, is trying to really define and establish, are we working within the parameters of a typical building delivery process? Because I think that it's really ultimately the building delivery process that needs to be changed, not necessarily the pre-design process. With that in mind, because the building delivery process itself has such an impact on the pre-design phase and the programming phase at that point, especially because, well, once an architect wins the bid, so to speak, they could just build a box and the client would have to deal with it. So for all purposes of this particular assignment, we wanted to go with more of an idea of it's open and sky's the limit, and let's pretend that those things don't necessarily exist. We'll try to keep them in the back of our minds. So with that, it's a case of the architect, we just said, okay, the architect's here in this.
So you're the hired architect from outside?
Correct.
Very good argument.
And you know, again, I just want to say this again and again. Architects don't bid for their projects. They don't come in, oh, I'll give you this for this fee.
They get their
That's,
qualifications.
yeah, you get picked on qualifications. Nobody talks about what your fee is or how much you're charging. That's not part of the process. Yeah.
Because then I live in the state of Florida, because I know in Georgia and North South West in addition, they have bidding process.
That's becoming the norm with developers and other people, and I think it's a really bad thing.
I mean, it is because of quality work sometimes, you know,
Yeah.
because.
You know, going with a low bid is always a bad idea, and going with a low bid of an architect for design services is an even worse idea. Sorry, go ahead.
All right. And then, yeah, that was it as far as our feasibility study.
We were just trying to set ourselves up for the next
Yeah.
step.
Yeah.
So we started diagramming some of the information flow through the school and primary spaces, and then, this is all just in progress, kind of, we're still reworking diagrams and everything.
The idea that essentially the next step would be the information gathering and what the different individuals would bring to the table to then review and have meetings and decide on.
But you know, that diagram that you showed with the relationships, that's really now getting into programming, you know, and
Right.
it's getting a little ahead of where I thought you'd be now. But if it's to show a format, then that's a different thing. You know, I did see these slides on your group page. I didn't know at the time, which was, you know, a day ago or so, that was actually a total final presentation. So just to let you know, I've seen these before. Okay. Anybody else want to make any comments about this? I mean, there are a couple of these that I want to show, partly because they show a lot more content than some of the others, and a lot more detail. And I guess along with that comes perhaps a lot more thought, a lot more effort. And so if your team didn't do something somewhat equivalent, then you need to redo it or add to it and resubmit it. And I really want everyone to resubmit by Monday. And in some cases, it might just be putting a few citations in other cases, maybe adding one or two additional slides. That's what I don't really want to give some of the teams a grade based upon what they submitted, because it wouldn't be very pretty. Okay, let's have another one. Let's go to, let's go to this one. and I thought, that's weird, that looks so familiar. When we,
It's like a generic template from Microsoft.
well, you know what it is? What it reminded me of was when we arrived in Canada as refugees. And no, that's not funny. We were refugees. No one in our family spoke English, and so my parents got these books on how to speak English, and the graphics were exactly like this. You know, these primitive sort of graphic stuff, and so it just brought back fond memories looking at that, of struggling with trying to learn how to speak English.
All right, so we're taking a very integrated project delivery approach to the entire process, including the early design activities. And let me see if this, okay, there we go. This one was our own. So this is how we put together our idea of our integrated project delivery team from looking at other examples online and things that have been done in other studies. And basically what we have is a core group of people who are responsible for making decisions jointly together. And that involves the owner of the stakeholder, which would be more like Florida State and the state of Florida and FAMU, the university. And then the owner user group, which would be the School of Architecture. And then an architect and a contractor who would all be brought into this IPD process early on, selected based on qualifications. And then they would also bring in their own engineers and primary trade contractors. They all enter into a integrated delivery contract, basically, where they all share the risk associated with the project, and they also all share the benefits of creating a good product.
Can I ask, who's the facilitator here?
There's not someone in our group necessarily that we've assigned to that. We've assigned each of us to the four
Right.
core roles. But most of the projects that I've seen done with an integrated process so far that I've researched, they have someone who serves as a facilitator to sort of help mediate meetings and make sure that certain decisions are come to, that they come to agreement at the core, and that they're also in agreement with the goals that were originally set out in the project. So
But
there's sort of a
what's their
mediator.
background? What's their profession? Who are they?
It's varied as some of the ones I've looked. Some of them have more of an architecture background. Some of them have like a facility management background. And some of them, it seems like, have more of the, like BIM tools and technology background. In other words, how they can help use those tools to help this team collaborate more efficiently.
Yeah.
I would suspect some of them are probably, I don't know, there's probably even like a training program, a lot of times there's that
So
kind
it's
of
just
thing.
people with a background being
But
engineers.
people that have a background
I've
in
seen
it.
one that's an interior designer.
And they're the only person that is removed from being a part of the IPD contract, so they're not necessarily they're not a risk holder.
Yeah,
They're
they're
just there
the
to help make it happen.
facilitator.
Yeah,
They make-
completely
make it
facilitator.
run smoothly.
They're supposed to be neutral, supposed to be.
That
How
might
do
be
you do that?
that might be an emerging profession.
And it could also be that just because this is sort of a new way of delivering a project, that's necessary. I hope that in the future, if we're moving towards this kind of process, you might need less and less of that because it sort of becomes business as usual. The way people do things is to collaborate. But right now, you've got to sort of get people to even understand how to collaborate and work with each other because it's very different.
But non-hierarchical systems like this are really difficult. It's easier to have a hierarchy where you have a person in charge and you have people who answer to that person, and then other people down here who do the tasks and our line staff.
Right.
And when you have this, and in fact, working in your student teams is a simulation of a flat organization trying to work with everybody having the same sort of status. No one's the boss.
Right.
And you probably have experienced the difficulties of that, because with the boss, sometimes the boss can just overrule you and say, no, this is the way we're doing it. But if it's all kind of negotiated and everything, then it becomes much more complicated and much more likely to have disagreements that can't be resolved that easily, and so on and so on. So is there within this model someone who outranks in that middle circle, who outranks the others?
Most of the research we did for IPDs that have been done so far, ultimately they said the core group is responsible. They're actually contractually bound to each other to make decisions together. However, the owner usually still has the final say. In other words, the person with the checkbook is ultimately gonna say, this is the direction that we're headed, but,
You know, in the traditional system, the owner hires the architect, and the architect becomes the owner's representative. And I could imagine that could still be functioning here to some degree.
So this is something that we came across as we were looking through, and we thought it was a good way to sort of show how we saw the programming happening. And really, we started to see the program becoming this sort of fluid thing that very early on is sort of moving in tandem with the early design processes, so that we're going to be sort of focusing on this area, that during this early design phase, the program and the schemes are developing sort of concurrently, and there's sort of this little bit of this push and pull of, you don't really get into the details of the program until you're starting to develop some of the schemes and the conceptual ideas, and that helps you flesh out those finer details. And we just felt like this was a really good graphic, because in most situations, you have all of these different people and engineers and whatnot that feed into the project, but a lot of times it feeds in and they don't really start to collaborate with each other until you're getting to like here. And then all of a sudden there's this clash detection, and it says, oh, this isn't going to fit, or this isn't actually going to make the building perform the way we want to. And a lot of times, once you're at this point, you're already moving into construction. Sometimes there's not anything that you can do about that, or it's very costly to do something about it. So by doing more of the coordination with everyone on the team involved up earlier, ideally you're going to get a better product. So
You know, going back, just, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but where it says conceptual design, I assume that means conceptual designs, plural.
yes,
That at that point,
yeah, in ours we're looking at options.
yeah, that point,
More than one.
because you've got the computer capability to do this, you can spit out a number of alternatives in that, at that conceptual level, and then take some of them into the schematic design phase even,
Right.
and still be evaluating and developing alternatives until you arrive at the one that seems to perform.
Right. Yep. So this was just a small diagram that kind of showed that idea that you really get the greatest leverage in affecting your outcomes by thinking about them earlier in the phase. And this was the one that we took from HOK that we thought was really great. This is typical, you know, the cost that's involved with making changes, so the later you get across time, it's more costly. The ability to control cost is really happening early in the design. And so in traditional processes, this is sort of where we're sitting right now. A lot of times when things are changing during the construction documents time, that's when they usually discover things that aren't working well. And the integrated process is trying to push that over and improve the results that you're getting. And they're also.
I like the fact that there's a litigation phase.
Yeah.
You know, that is, in every project, there is a litigation phase. They don't talk about it at the front end, but.
So for integrated process, the first thing that they tend to do once they've executed that contract to get together is they have this first collaborative meeting, and it's seen as sort of this kickoff visioning session. And this is where they define very briefly the program. It's general things like occupancy. Are we talking about occupancy for 200 people or 2,000 people? Are we talking about, you know, kind of those very coarse-grained type of ideas so that you know the scale and the scope of the project that you're looking at. So these are some of the activities that we'll be doing in that. And these I'll kind of go through quickly because I'll show our work plan for working through these later. So understanding project objectives. This is literally a session from the Phipps Conservatory building and meeting that they had, one of their first visioning sessions where they literally have everyone in the room that's sitting down with the trace paper and working out what they want to do. Understanding business objectives, aligning all the parties to the project objectives, that's a really important part of the integrated process. A lot of places they called it a scorecard, but it's sort of that matrix of how do we now establish that as a team we're achieving the different goals that we have and what are the rewards for achieving those goals.
And the other word there that's important is metrics. You know, things become measurable when you start using something like a BIM model, and
Yeah, it allows you to do that. And just kind of working through the process, this idea that as you're going through these conceptual and eventually coming to sort of these schematic design options, that because of the collaboration that you're doing and because of the BIM tools that you can use, you can do a lot of iterations very quickly and analyze them and validate them and send them back through and keep making improvements and sort of pushing and pulling that design until you get to something where you really want to move forward in the process. So this was our work plan. We sat down and divided ourselves up as the different people that would be involved in the core group and said, okay, before we even get to that very first meeting as an IPD team, what do we all need to bring to the table? So Craig is the owner stakeholder, he represents the university. So the university's gonna have certain goals they wanna achieve. They're gonna be the person laying out the budget, and the university is probably also gonna have certain standards of the way they want buildings done, or a certain image that they want.
Has to have brick.
Yeah, exactly. The owner user group, Kyle, he would be representing, the School of Architecture, and so he might be doing surveys of the faculty and helping them sort of establish their goals and their vision. So that's one of the things he's going to be bringing to the table when we get to that first IPD meeting. The architect, Amber, who's in Orlando with us, we actually had a great conference call in order to put all this together. But early as the architect, because she would be selected based on qualifications and not on already having to have a plan that she's trying to sell to the owner group, this is the place where she can sort of come in with also maybe big conceptual ideas that she might have that she wants to share. And what she said was, I would probably research my client to kind of get to know them a little bit so that when I came to that IPD, I might know something a little bit about what they already could be looking for and how we could make this a state-of-the-art type of thing. But she said, you wouldn't really come in with too much more than that because the idea is that the design's going to take place as a team. She's not going to come in and already have conceptual diagrams.
No preconceived ideas.
So.
Are you guys gonna Skype with,
Yeah, we're thinking about doing Skype for some of the future ones. We did a conference call,
We
but we
spoke
thought
last night, but it's
for our meetings, we would probably do Skype so we can get things in front of each other. And then having a contractor on board, I felt like early on, I could already be looking at the site and helping to do some site analysis and talking to civil engineer and basic things like soil tests that a contractor would do so that when you walk into that IPD meeting, sort of like what happened with this building the first time, they wanted to put it at the edge and then they got bed soil and had to push it back 25 feet. So if I could come into the meeting with some of that information already about what's going on with the site as this building was burned down, that could be really helpful when we're getting in there.
One thing I think that's great about this is that having Amber off-site is actually very much of a simulation of what happens now a lot, where you have consultants that aren't there on site, or you have participants in the team, and they, they use other ways of communicating, getting together, and that's going to be more and more common.
And then the next thing, we would be having our first IPD meeting. So we would meet as a core. In the real world, we'd have your full IPD team there with all of your engineers and everyone you'd be bringing to the table as well, and that would be our initial visioning session. So those are some of the things that we'd be trying to do during that meeting as per the early phase. And then after that, we felt like from that, we could go out and break out and kind of do some further research and development of our ideas before we come back for another collaborative session. So as a core, one of the ideas that came up with was that you might want to travel to other new facilities, particularly schools of architecture, and see them, or conduct further research about some of those things just using the internet, to get additional project info, what practices were working well and which ones weren't. And then we sort of divided up other things we would do individually. So again, Craig, as the owner stakeholder, he would probably be going back to the university and to the state of Florida and sort of validating some of these ideas we came up with, and looking at if there were any opportunities for, having to push and pull things around with budget or whatnot. Kyle as user group, we were hoping maybe that the architect at this stage would now be ready to maybe do sort of a co-hosting of a design charrette. Because we were thinking that when it was done originally, there was sort of the charrette done, but it was outside of the architect. And so even though those ideas got sent to the architect wasn't involved. And so.
Well, the members of the architect's office were distributed among the teams that were doing the charrette.
They already had an idea that they had really presented to the university before they even got to that phase.
It was kind of a sham.
Would happen early enough that maybe, some of those good ideas could actually get in there. And Amber, as a part of this particular type of process, was very interested in doing that.
Yeah.
And sort of hosting that design charrette. And then based on the ideas that came out of our first meeting and some of the information, so you could at least bring that information to the charrette, and then this information would go back to the next meeting we had. So she would be co-hosting the charrette. And as a contractor, I'd be looking into, you can fast track a lot of this when you come on board early. So you could be helping to remediate the site, could also be potentially looking for like salvage materials. I mean, this building has a lot of brick, even if it burned to the ground. There might be brick that's reusable that we may want to reincorporate into it. So being able to source materials having that be a part of the conceptual
I
design.
would think the contractor would also be very important in advising on constructability, on what things are going to be unnecessarily expensive to build.
Right.
Because of unavailability of materials, or labor market doesn't have the trades, or,
Absolutely.
whatever.
Yeah, and that's where them sort of bringing in their primary trade contractors comes into play, because they can work with each other to kind of come up with what are the best options for this and the cost implications. Even of basic things like choosing whether to do a concrete or a steel building. That's something that in those early phases, a contractor and their team can help determine. So the next thing we would do, would go back into a collaborative session. Again, we would meet as a core. We further start to refine those program requirements, set our benchmarks, start really using and incorporating the BIM tools. So you probably have an energy modeler and a BIM modeler and people in that room with you that can literally sit down and take those ideas and start putting them into the programs and being able to do some quick analysis. And then at the end, we would basically just continue to collaborate through file exchange. And that's when you start adding details to the building model. And you come up with a set of schematic design options that can be agreed on by the core. And then the final say then goes to that owner group. We hope that it would be to the School of Architecture owner group. But, because ideally these schematic design options should have already taken into account things like budget and things that the university wants. So if you've got options that meet what FAMU and the state of Florida want, then you should be able to go to the owner group and say, which of these schemes works best for you, ideally. And so the schematic options and the team documents that would be sort of documenting our process would really be the fleshing out of what now becomes a defined program. So you sort of get a program and schematic options complete by the end of that phase.
So the schematic options get to a point where you select an option and then program it, or do you still have options?
No, I think the options sort of define what the program is. There might be different ways of achieving it, but they're starting to hone in on having sort of a similar basis of design, basis of requirements.
Because I think the other possibility is that in this whole process, this iterative process, and you're generating these schematic options, it may become very clear from the analysis that the program, the BIM is doing and so on, which option is the most desirable one to
Yeah.
pursue, and then you would take that one and develop the program for it.
To kind of go into
Instead of trying to develop, flesh out the program and develop it on several options.
Yeah, I think the program definitely becomes sort of dependent on the schematic options and the information you pull out of the software tools that you're
Yeah.
using for that.
And the great thing about that is that a lot of programming pretends to be neutral, design neutral, solution neutral, but there's always a bias built in of the programmer as to what they think the design should be, whether they do this consciously or unconsciously. And so in a kind of a funny kind of way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy based upon the way the programming has been programmed as to what the design will be like. And in this case, the design schematics and the design conceptual ideas are going to drive the program rather than the other way around, which personally I think is a wonderful thing, because too many times I saw the programming that I was doing result in kind of mediocre buildings or uninteresting buildings, or buildings that were nothing special. They worked fine, but it's not something I would want to show you pictures of.
And then we used sort of the schedule that had been a part of the syllabus, and we adapted it, and we sort of looked at the same thing. Okay, we have until this date, that's about 2 months from now. Let's break it up on about 2 weeks or so apiece. So we would kind of conduct some of those pre-meeting activities that we wanted to do, and then we'd have a meeting. And then within about a week or so of that meeting, we would have some sort of, just the same way you do with any other meeting, you have sort of your meeting minutes, your things and the tasks that were given to everybody and what was accomplished in that meeting. And then, yeah, exactly, action items. And then a couple of weeks later, we would have do for ourselves these other research activities that we felt we had done. We'd have another meeting. We'd have our action list again, as Craig put it, for our team meeting. And then by that last day, we'd be able to have our final program.
And I think it's very important to keep to that schedule, so don't feel like each step has to be totally complete.
Mm-hmm.
It has to have at least representative examples of the product that comes from that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you only have a chance to have maybe 2 meetings, record those meetings, even though in reality there might be 20 meetings.
Right.
Or if the research activity should cover this much and you're only able in the time frame to cover this much, that's fine.
Right.
As long as there's a description that this is the scope of what research should consist of, and here's an illustrative example of that you know, with
Okay.
this part. Because that makes it more feasible. You can't possibly,
No, this would
do
actually
this.
be a real programming schedule, but
Yeah,
this
you
is our
couldn't.
schedule for here.
this is like a 6-month process.
Right.
At least, or a
But it is
10-month
2 months.
process, and you're compressing it into 2 months. And this is, just for everybody else, this came closest to what I was looking for. This is really what I hope all the teams would do. Give a definitive sort of deliverables within the time frame we have, and with a clear understanding of what the job is. Yeah.
So, okay, because I kind of was under the impression that it was more like a work plan diagrammatic kind of scheduling thing to assess like where we are within the process, as opposed to, you know, like when we were gonna submit later on, you know, like all the deliverables with each, you know, indicating each and everything, like step by step possible we're supposed to be doing. I thought that's what like this was kind of like assess where we were and kind of, you know, try to plan for the future. So is this like from now on you want every like this how it is now to have like each detail of the working process listed?
Well, that's what a work plan is.
Okay. Well, because like when I looked at the work plan, it was more of like a scheduling kind of thing. So allow you to know, who's working with who, like, you know.
Well, this is a schedule. This is scheduling.
Okay.
And this, this ties back to what the roles are of the individuals, the previous slides. Some of you just gave me a timeline and just showed, over a period of not way beyond the semester, a process diagram that was a bar chart showing, activities that had to occur and how long they would take and how they were, in some cases, how they were interrelated and so on. That was okay, but it wasn't nearly the complete story of what I was looking for, and it certainly didn't need to include all the way through occupancy. Didn't need to include how long it was going to take for the construction part, and so on and so forth.
So the purpose of the project was just the pre-design program.
That's what the class is called, pre-design. It's called programming, design, and theory.
So
It's not.
For simulation purposes, it just stops at that point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
I have a question. Are we required to do interviews and those sort of
Oh,
things?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we were
How
talking
realistic
like,
does it have to be?
like hypothetically, we would do surveys and this kind of thing. Can we just come up with something that we think would be the results of a survey, or do we need to actually go out and like survey students and faculty, or how much of the role playing do you want us to actually do? I guess is what we were wondering.
Well, it's a really good question, and I kind of am leaving it up to you, because you can do it. You're doing a representative sample, so you could just survey a couple of people in your studio and say, okay, that's a representative sample of the student body, and you could talk to myself and maybe another faculty member and say you're doing a representative survey of faculty's feelings and opinions, and you don't have to do 100. It's not a statistically valid survey of any sort. You don't have the number in the sample size is so small. But you should go through that. So you end up with a sense of what the questions would be and what the topics would be for those kinds of things.
We thought you might say that. That's why we figured someone here locally would be better as the owner or user group representative.
Yeah.
Because we felt like for Amber to be in the architect's role would be an easier role for her to be sort of remote and be able to do things through technology, whereas the user group person, Kyle, needed to be here to do those things.
And having taught Amber and chairing her thesis committee and everything, she is very creative, and she has this kind of her thinking process about design is out there. So she'll bring in innovation and so on. So. Carlos, did you have a question?
I had a question for you necessarily. How you mentioned earlier about when you do a lot of programming and you had an idea, I guess, or you expected the building to be more innovative or inventive, and it was kind of plain building. I wanted to know, did you provide any information or insight to the architect, or you just submitted the program to them? providing for the designs or?
Both. I mean, there were some projects I was involved in where we spent a lot of time with the design architect during their early design phase. And those tended to be a lot better projects than the ones where we were just gave them the document and never really had that communication. So what we normally did when we worked with the architect in the early phases was we would kind of tell them what's wrong with the program and what to, and you know, usually what they did was they had their own ideas, they would sketch up some ideas, they would put the program on a shelf somewhere. And they would look at it later. They would look at it at some point when they were being held accountable for the design. And the client would look at it more often than the design architect because the client wanted to make sure they were getting what they were hoping to get in terms of what the building could do. Was it the right size? Did it have the right rooms in it? But some architects who perhaps took a different view of what designing is would go through the program and take each room and do a little squared on bubble diagram and connect all the rooms in the proper relationships and then put a big wall around it and a roof on it and say, there's my building. And that was horrible. Because there was no conceptual idea, there was no bigger idea, there was no designing, it was planning and arranging. And so that, you know, is one of the tricky things about giving a program to an architect if the architect doesn't know how to handle it. So we have 5 more minutes, so mercifully we don't have time for any of the other presentations. We saw the 2 best ones, and you need to judge yours against those 2 and go back and add something to yours. Now that you, and I take some of the blame for the lack of communication with some of the teams and the misunderstanding, but there were definitely some misunderstandings with some of the teams, and I want you to flesh out, make your presentation appropriate, resubmit it, and then I'll start planning and working with the rest of the semester, because my goal here is to take what you're proposing as your schedule for the semester and really pay attention to it in planning my schedule, so that I provide the opportunities you need for certain things to happen, even during class time. Whether it's necessary for you to engage in some activity that can only occur during class time, or whether it's an opportunity for you to make some kind of report to the group as a whole, or whatever it is. And I want to see how the different work plans line up. See if we have certain dates where I can say, oh, everybody is going to have a deliverable now, so let's get together and look at each other's deliverables. Or whether it's a time for everybody in the class to be out interviewing, and so that day, that will be the nature of the class. Because I know it's a 3-credit-hour class, and it's very easy for this class to consume way more of your time and effort than we could probably justify with the number of credits that you're here for. So, you know, I'm mindful of that. I know you have studio, you have other things going on. Are there any questions? Anybody want to talk to me now after class about theirs? So they are a little more clear on what I'm looking for based upon what they gave me? Okay. All right, so the rest of you, I guess,